Somewhere in your home there is probably a mirror, and somewhere in the back of your mind there is probably a rule about it. You know the rule, even if you have never thought carefully about where it came from. You know that breaking a mirror is bad luck. 7 years of it specifically, 7 years of misfortune that begin from the moment the glass hits the floor and scatters. You may not believe the rule in any literal sense. You may shake your head at it, acknowledge that it is superstition, remind yourself that the broken mirror is simply a practical inconvenience rather than a cosmic event. And yet, if you broke a mirror this evening, if you heard that particular crash and looked down at the shards, there would probably be a moment, brief, quickly suppressed, of something that was not quite worry, but was not quite nothing either. This script is about that moment, about where it comes from, how it got there, what it has meant across the thousands of years of human history that lie between the first reflective surface and the bathroom mirror you stepped past this morning. The 7-year bad luck belief is not simply a piece of residual superstition hanging on in a rational age. It is the visible tip of an extraordinarily deep and extraordinarily widespread body of human thought about mirrors, reflections, souls, and the relationship between the image and the thing imaged. Thought that stretches back to the earliest human encounters with reflective surfaces, that runs through ancient Egypt and Rome and medieval Europe and the Victorian parlour, and that persists in our own time in ways that are more interesting and more philosophically serious than the phrase old wives' tale might suggest. Tonight we will explore 10 quiet chapters on why breaking a mirror was believed to bring 7 years of bad luck. We will begin with the mirror itself, what it was, what it did, and why it was understood as a genuinely significant object rather than simply a piece of useful domestic equipment. We will look at the soul reflection belief, the ancient and widespread conviction that the image in the mirror was not merely an optical phenomenon, but a manifestation of the soul, with all the vulnerability that implies. We will visit ancient Rome, where the 7-year cycle first appeared in connection with the mirror and the body's renewal. We will follow the mirror through medieval Europe, where it gathered new layers of significance from the intersection of classical inheritance and Christian thought. We will examine the role of mirrors in death and mourning, the covering of mirrors that persisted across so many cultures, and that has its own distinct and fascinating logic. We will look at the mirror in magic and divination, the scrying glass, the dark mirror, the reflective surface as a portal to other knowledge. We will explore what Victorian science and Victorian superstition made of the belief simultaneously. We will trace the mirror bad luck belief through the literary and artistic traditions that gave it its most enduring forms. We will consider what the belief reveals about the psychology of superstition, why certain beliefs persist, what function they serve, what genuine human experience they encode, and finally, we will sit with what remains of all this in the contemporary world, what the moment of looking down at the broken glass still means, and why it still means something. Before we begin, if these slow journeys through the history of human belief bring you rest, I hope you will consider subscribing to the channel. And if the world of folklore and the mystical life speaks to you, our curated collection of nature-inspired shirts is linked in the description below. Now settle in, the mirror is intact. We're going to look carefully at what it contains, and then carefully and at a safe distance at what happens when it breaks. Before we can understand why breaking a mirror was believed to bring bad luck, we need to understand what a mirror was, not in the technical sense, but in the full cultural and material sense of what it meant to possess one and to look into one. The mirror, in its familiar modern form, a flat glass backing coated with a thin layer of silver or aluminium, producing a clear, accurate, undistorted reflection, is a relatively recent invention. The silvered glass mirror was developed in Venice in the 16th century and spread slowly across Europe over the following 2 centuries, remaining expensive and relatively rare until improvements in manufacturing technique in the 19th century made it affordable across the social spectrum. Before the silvered glass mirror, reflective surfaces were polished metal, bronze, copper, silver, and in the wealthiest households, gold, or in some traditions and periods, polished obsidian, the dark volcanic glass that produces a reflection of characteristic ambiguity, dark and slightly unclear, an image that is recognizably you but not quite the you that daylight shows. The polished metal mirror was not cheap in any period before the industrial age. It required significant quantities of a valuable material, expert craftsmanship to achieve the necessary degree of polish, and ongoing maintenance to prevent the tarnishing that would obscure the reflection. A good metal mirror was a luxury object, and like most luxury objects, it accumulated significance beyond its practical function. Mirrors were given as gifts at important occasions. They were included in dowries, they were bequeathed in wills, they were listed in inventories of household goods, alongside jewellery and fine cloth as items of particular value. The person who owned a mirror was a person who owned something rare and precious, and the object itself absorbed some of the prestige of rarity. The practical function of the mirror was the function that seems, in retrospect, almost too obvious to mention. It showed you your own face. This sounds trivial until you consider that for most of human history, the face you wore as you moved through the world was visible to everyone around you, and almost entirely invisible to yourself. You knew your face through descriptions, through the representations others made of it, through the distorted and unreliable glimpses afforded by water surfaces or other reflective materials you might chance to encounter. The mirror gave you what no other technology could: your face, as others saw it, available for sustained contemplation. This access to one's own face was not a trivial thing. The face was and is understood as the primary surface of the self, the part of the body through which identity is most legibly expressed, through which others read emotion and character and status, through which the social world makes its first and most lasting assessment of who you are. To see your own face clearly, in a way that allowed genuine examination, was to have access to something that had previously been available only to others. The mirror made the private face public to itself, and that transformation was experienced as genuinely significant in both the practical sense of allowing people to manage their appearance in ways they had not been able to manage it before, and in the deeper sense of creating a new kind of self-knowledge. The material quality of early mirrors contributed to the experience of looking into them. The polished metal surface produced a reflection that was warmer, slightly darker, and less sharply defined than the silvered glass mirror we are accustomed to. The reflection had a quality of depth that the flat modern mirror does not have, a sense of looking into the surface rather than at it, of the image existing within the material rather than on its face. This quality of depth was not simply a visual characteristic. It contributed to the sense, which we will explore at length in the next chapter, that the reflection was not merely an optical phenomenon, but something that resided within the mirror, something that was in there looking back. The obsidian mirror deserves particular attention because it represents the most ancient and most explicitly magical category of reflective surface. Obsidian is a naturally occurring volcanic glass, black and glassy, capable of being polished to a high shine. It was used as a mirror in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, where the deity Tezcatlipoca, whose name means smoking mirror, was associated with obsidian reflective surfaces that could reveal truths about the observer's soul and fate, and it was used in Europe by occultists and diviners from the medieval period onward. The Elizabethan astrologer John Dee famously used an obsidian mirror as a scrying tool, and the mirror he used is now in the collection of the British Museum. The obsidian mirror's dark reflection, an image that is recognisably you, but shadowed, ambiguous, slightly unreal, was understood as particularly revealing of what lay beneath the social surface. The development of the silvered glass mirror changed the relationship between people and their reflections in ways that were genuinely significant. The clarity of the glass mirror, the sharp, accurate, undistorted image it produced, was qualitatively different from what polished metal had provided. The glass mirror showed you something that was, for the first time, truly equivalent to what others saw when they looked at you. This clarity was both liberating and unsettling. Liberating because it finally gave accurate self-knowledge, unsettling because the accuracy left nowhere to hide. The mirror that showed you exactly as you were was the mirror that showed you everything you might have preferred not to see. It was with this clearer, more accurate, more expensive mirror, the glass mirror of the post-Venetian period, that the bad luck belief became most firmly attached to the consequences of breakage. Not because the sole beliefs that underlay the superstition were new, those beliefs were ancient, but because the glass mirror was more fragile than its metal predecessors, more expensive to replace, and more central to the daily practice of self-presentation in the households that owned one. The breaking of a glass mirror was a domestic catastrophe of significant practical consequence, and significant practical consequence tends to attract supernatural explanation. The Venetian mirror trade deserves particular attention as the economic context in which the bad luck belief acquired its most specific and most persistent form. Venice in the 16th century held a near monopoly on the production of high-quality silvered glass mirrors, and the Venetian government went to extraordinary lengths to protect that monopoly, including, according to various historical accounts, threatening the families of glassmakers who left Murano for other European states, and in some cases allegedly arranging the assassination of glassmakers who had emigrated and were threatening to establish competing production elsewhere. The mirrors that emerged from Murano were the finest in Europe, clearer, more stable in their silvering, more precisely flat in their glass, and they commanded extraordinary prices. A large Venetian mirror sold in Paris in the 17th century might cost several times the price of an equivalent-sized oil painting by a notable artist. When such an object broke, the practical loss was substantial. A large Venetian mirror was an investment, a treasure, an object whose loss represented a genuine financial blow to the household that owned it. The supernatural weight attached to its breakage, the 7 years of bad luck, was, in this economic context, not merely an expression of ancient superstition, but also a folk recognition of the genuine seriousness of the loss. The 7 years of bad luck was partly a way of saying something genuinely important has been destroyed here, something whose loss will have real consequences for this household, something whose absence will be felt for a long time. The supernatural language was the most emphatic language available for expressing the magnitude of a significant material loss. The gradual cheapening of mirrors through the 18th and 19th centuries, as manufacturing improvements in France, England, and eventually everywhere made the silvered glass mirror affordable to the middle classes and eventually to the working classes, changed the economic dimension of mirror breakage without changing the superstition. The cheap Victorian mirror could be replaced for a shilling. Its loss was nothing like the catastrophe that a Venetian mirror's loss had represented. But the bad luck belief, once established in the culture, had become self-sustaining, maintained now not by the economic reality of irreplaceable luxury objects, but by the cultural transmission of a belief that had originally been attached to such objects. The mirror mattered because it showed something that mattered: the face, the self, the soul, and the belief that breaking it had consequences beyond the practical, that the shattering of the image entailed some damage to the thing image, was a belief that took the mirror's significance seriously, that refused to reduce the reflection to mere optics. In the old understanding, what you saw in the mirror was not nothing, and what happened to that image when the mirror broke was not nothing either. The mirror's role as a status object across different periods and cultures illuminates why its breakage attracted such elaborate supernatural explanation. In societies where status objects are understood as carrying something of the prestige and the power of their owner, where the nobleman's sword was not merely a weapon but an extension of his honour, where the rich man's plate was not merely tableware but a display of his worth, the destruction of a high-status object was always more than a practical loss. It was a symbolic diminishment, a reduction of the person's standing in the material world, a kind of visible wound. The mirror, as a high-status object that additionally showed the owner's own face, that participated uniquely in the owner's self-presentation and self-knowledge, was a particularly intimate member of this category. Its destruction was not merely the loss of property, but the loss of a specific kind of self-knowledge and self-presentation that nothing else could quite replace. The practice of giving mirrors as wedding gifts, documented across many European traditions from the medieval period onward, is worth noting as evidence of the mirror's symbolic significance beyond its practical function. The wedding mirror was not simply a useful household object. It was an object specifically charged with the beginning of a new life, the life of the married couple in their joint household, and with all the hopes and aspirations that a beginning carried. A wedding mirror that broke was therefore not simply a broken household object. It was a broken omen, a damaged symbol of the beginning that had been carefully constructed and carefully given. The bad luck that followed was the bad luck of a beginning disrupted, of a hope shattered along with the glass. The mirror mattered because it showed something that mattered: the face, the self, the soul, and the belief that breaking it had consequences beyond the practical, that the shattering of the image entailed some damage to the thing imaged, was a belief that took the mirror's significance seriously, that refused to reduce the reflection to mere optics. In the old understanding, what you saw in the mirror was not nothing, and what happened to that image when the mirror broke was not nothing either. The most fundamental belief underlying the mirror bad luck superstition is one of the oldest beliefs in human thought: the belief that the reflection is not merely an image of the person reflected, but a manifestation of that person's soul. This belief appears in cultures so widely separated by geography and history that it cannot be explained by diffusion from a single source. It is present in ancient Egypt, where the soul concept known as the ka was intimately connected to the image, to the physical representation of a person, in art, in statue, in reflection, in ways that made the image and the soul nearly identical. It is present in ancient Greece, where the word for image, eidolon, was also the word for the ghost of the dead. The image was the soul in its visible form. It is present in numerous indigenous cultures around the world, where the reflection in still water is treated with specific care and specific rules about what should and should not be done with it. It appears in the folklore of medieval Europe, in the practices of Victorian spiritualism, and in the attenuated but recognizable form of the contemporary mirror superstition. The Egyptian ka is perhaps the most fully developed ancient expression of this soul image connection. The ka was understood as the vital force or spiritual double of a person, born at the same time as the person, accompanying them through life and surviving death as an entity that needed to be nourished and sustained. The ka required images of the person to sustain itself. This is one of the reasons why ancient Egyptian art so consistently depicted its subjects clearly and completely, and why the defacement of a person's image, the removal of their name or their face from inscriptions and monuments, was understood as an act of genuine spiritual harm. To damage the image was to damage the ka. The Greek philosopher Plato's theory of forms, which held that visible things in the world were imperfect copies of ideal, non-material forms that existed in a higher reality, contributed a philosophical framework within which the reflection's relationship to the person could be understood in a different but related way. If the visible body was itself a copy of a more real original, and the reflection was a copy of the visible body, then the reflection was a two removes from the true original. But it was also, paradoxically, more perfect in some respects, more complete in its presentation of the visible form than the form itself could offer from any single viewpoint. The reflection caught something. The question was what? The most direct ancient expression of the mirror-soul connection comes from the widespread belief that what we now call soul loss could be caused by damage to the reflection. The person who broke the reflected image, who shattered the pool in which they were reflected, who cracked the polished surface that showed their face, had, in this understanding, damaged a component of their own spiritual constitution. The damage was not necessarily fatal. The soul had a resilience that allowed it to recover from such injuries over time. But the recovery took time, and during the recovery period, the person was spiritually weakened, vulnerable to illness, to misfortune, to the kinds of harm that a fully intact soul would have been better positioned to resist. The belief that reflections carry something of the soul also explains several folk practices that might otherwise seem puzzling. The widespread custom, across many cultures, of being careful not to have your reflection seen in certain circumstances, not to look at your own reflection when seriously ill, not to allow your reflection to appear in a mirror in a house of the dead, not to have your reflection seen by certain kinds of malevolent beings. All of these make sense if the reflection is understood as a vulnerable, accessible manifestation of the soul. A malevolent being that could see your reflection had, in effect, a degree of access to your soul. The careful person protected their reflection as they would protect any other vulnerable part of themselves. The connection between the reflection and the soul was not understood as absolute and literal in most traditions. Most people did not believe that looking at their own reflection was inherently dangerous, or that seeing a cracked reflection in a wavy surface meant permanent soul damage. The connection was more nuanced than that. The reflection was soul-adjacent, soul-carrying, soul-revealing in ways that made it genuinely significant without being absolutely equivalent to the soul itself. It was the most accessible external manifestation of the soul, and what happened to it had implications for the soul without necessarily having one-to-one consequences for the soul. The ancient belief that mirrors showed more than the physical face, that a skilled or sensitive observer could see things in a mirror that the ordinary eye could not, including truths about the observed person's character, fate, and inner life, is the foundation of the mirror divination tradition that we will explore in a later chapter, but it is also relevant here because it confirms the basic soul-mirror connection. If mirrors showed something of the soul, then breaking the mirror was not simply breaking a piece of equipment. It was disrupting a channel through which the soul was visible, accessible, and in some sense present in the world outside the body. The Roman tradition, which we will examine at greater length in the next chapter, added to this ancient soul mirror belief a specific temporal dimension, the 7-year cycle that gave the superstition the precise memorable form in which it has persisted to the present day. But the Roman contribution was a specification and a formalization of something older, the pre-existing, widely distributed, deeply rooted sense that the reflection was not nothing, that what the mirror contained was connected to the person reflected in ways that went beyond optics, and that what happened to the mirror therefore had implications for what happened to the person. The anthropological documentation of soul reflection beliefs across cultures is extensive enough to constitute a genuine cross-cultural pattern rather than a coincidence of independent invention. The anthropologist James George Frazer, whose monumental comparative mythology, The Golden Bough, catalogued examples from hundreds of cultures, devoted considerable attention to what he called the external soul, the belief that the soul could reside in objects outside the body, including mirrors and other reflective surfaces. Frazer documented beliefs from Melanesia, from West Africa, from various indigenous cultures of the Americas, from Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, all converging on the same fundamental idea that the image made of a person's body in a reflective surface was connected to that person's vital force in ways that made the image vulnerable and therefore worth protecting. The specific vulnerability of the reflected soul was understood differently in different traditions, but certain themes recurred. The reflection was understood as the soul's outer garment, the most accessible and most fragile layer of the soul's presence in the world, the layer that could be seen, and therefore the layer that could be reached. To harm the reflection was to harm the outer garment, which might or might not harm the soul beneath, depending on how deep the damage went. A small damage, a momentary distortion, a brief interruption of the reflection, was like a minor wound to the outer layer, uncomfortable but not catastrophic. A complete shattering of the reflection, the mirror broken into pieces, the whole image destroyed, was like the destruction of the outer garment entirely, leaving the soul exposed in ways it had not been prepared for. The water reflection, the original mirror, the surface in which humans first saw their own faces clearly, was treated with particular care in traditions around the world. In many cultures, looking at your own reflection in still water at certain times was prohibited. At night, during periods of illness or mourning, when the person was spiritually weakened by grief or fear, the still pool or the calm river surface was understood as a window between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and the reflection that appeared in it was therefore particularly close to the soul's most vulnerable dimension, the dimension that interfaced with death and the afterlife. We no longer believe in the explicit way that the ancient traditions believed that our reflections carry our souls, but the feeling that they do, the brief, quickly suppressed sense that the broken mirror is more than a broken mirror, is still there. It persists because it is encoding something true. The mirror really does show something intimate and significant about us, something that we experience as important, and that we are right to experience as important. The soul language of the ancient traditions was the best language they had for something real. The language has changed. The reality it was pointing at has not. The mirror's capacity to show the self at different times of life, to make visible the changes that the self undergoes through illness, aging, grief, and recovery, gave it a particular relationship to the soul's own temporal dimension. If the soul had a history as well as a present condition, then the mirror that showed the soul's present condition was also implicitly showing the distance between that condition and the soul's best condition, the comparison between now and before, between the self as it is and the self as it was and might again be. The broken mirror disrupted this temporal self-knowledge as well as the simple present moment self-knowledge. It removed the instrument through which the self tracked its own changes and gauged its own progress. The 7 years of bad luck was, in part, the 7 years required for the self to recover the capacity for this kind of temporal self-reflection. The specific horror of the shattered mirror, as opposed to merely the cracked mirror or the clouded mirror, is related to the multiplication of the image that shattering produces. Each shard of a broken mirror reflects a partial, distorted fragment of the face that had previously been shown whole and complete. The whole becomes many fragments. The unified image becomes a multiplicity of partial images. In the soul reflection framework, this multiplication was genuinely disturbing. The soul, which had been one and unified in its reflection, was now scattered across dozens or hundreds of shards, each containing a piece of it, none containing the whole. The reassembly of a shattered mirror was impossible. The reassembly of the soul's reflection was therefore equally impossible, at least until the 7-year renewal had completed its cycle. We no longer believe, in the explicit way that the ancient traditions believed, that our reflections carry our souls. But the feeling that they do, the brief, quickly suppressed sense that the broken mirror is more than a broken mirror, is still there. It persists because it is encoding something true. The mirror really does show something intimate and significant about us, something that we experience as important and that we are right to experience as important. The soul language of the ancient traditions was the best language they had for something real. The language has changed. The reality it was pointing at has not. Of all the elements of the mirror bad luck superstition, the most specific, and therefore the most puzzling, is the number 7. Not 1 year of bad luck, not an indefinite period of misfortune, not the rest of your life, but precisely 7 years, a period that is specific enough to be meaningful and long enough to be genuinely frightening. Where did the 7 years come from? What logic attached exactly that duration to the consequence of breaking a mirror? The answer leads us to ancient Rome and to a belief about the human body that was, in its own way, a remarkable piece of proto-biological thinking. The Roman belief, documented in the writings of Pliny the Elder and other classical authors, was that the human body renewed itself completely every 7 years, that within a 7-year cycle, every part of the physical body was replaced, every tissue regenerated, every cell, in modern terms, renewed with new material. This belief was not entirely without empirical foundation. The Romans had observed that people looked noticeably different at 7-year intervals, that wounds healed over 7-year periods, that certain diseases ran their course in 7-year cycles, that the body was in some observable sense a different physical object from the one it had been 7 years previously. The 7-year renewal was the Romans' best attempt to account for these observations within their available conceptual framework. This belief in the 7-year bodily renewal provided the logical foundation for the mirror bad luck duration. If the reflection in the mirror was connected to the body, if it was, as the soul reflection belief maintained, a manifestation of the body's spiritual dimension, then the reflection was renewed at the same rate as the body. A broken mirror, which had shattered and therefore disrupted the body's reflected image, would take 7 years to fully repair the disruption, because the body that the reflection had been showing would take 7 years to completely renew itself, to rebuild the physical substrate that the reflection manifested. The bad luck lasted 7 years, because that was how long it took for the person's body to become, in every physical sense, a new body, one that had no connection to the broken reflection. The number 7 had additional resonance in Roman culture and in the broader Greco-Roman Jewish cultural complex that formed the foundation of Western thought. 7 was the number of the known planets in ancient astronomy: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and each planet was associated with a day of the week and with specific qualities and influences. 7 was the number of completion and of cosmic order. The 7 days of creation in the Genesis account, the 7 seals of the Book of Revelation, the 7 wonders of the ancient world. To say that something lasted 7 years was to say that it lasted for a complete cosmic cycle, for the period that the universe itself required to fully renew and restore what had been disrupted. The 7-year period also appears in connection with legal and contractual arrangements in the ancient world in ways that suggest it was understood as the natural minimum period for a significant obligation to be honoured or discharged. 7 years of service, 7 years of exile, 7 years of mourning. These appear in various ancient legal and religious traditions as the appropriate duration for conditions that were serious enough to require extended time for resolution, but not so severe as to be permanent. The mirror's 7 years of bad luck fitted naturally into this cultural framework. It was the period during which the consequences of a serious disruption worked themselves out, after which the account was balanced and the ordinary world could resume. The specific duration also served a practical social function within the belief system. A period of 7 years was long enough to be a genuine deterrent, long enough to make the prospect of breaking a mirror genuinely frightening, long enough to make the care taken around mirrors feel worth the effort. But it was not so long as to be entirely hopeless. 7 years was survivable. It had an end. It was finite. The person who had broken a mirror could look forward, at least in principle, to a time when the bad luck would lift, and the ordinary run of good and ill fortune would resume. This combination of genuine consequence and eventual resolution gave the belief a particular emotional character, serious but not despairing, frightening but not without hope. The Romans also contributed to the mirror superstition, the specific association between mirror breakage and health. The belief that breaking a mirror was particularly likely to result in illness, injury, or death in the period following the breakage. This was a direct application of the soul-mirror connection. If the mirror carried the soul, then damaging it was damaging the soul, and the soul's damage would express itself in the body as a physical vulnerability. The mirror that broke and scattered might scatter something of the self along with it, leaving the person temporarily depleted in the spiritual resilience that kept them well. The route by which the Roman belief passed into British and Irish folk tradition is the route of Roman cultural influence more generally. Through the Roman occupation of Britain, through the persistence of Roman cultural elements in post-Roman Britain, through the medieval Latin texts that preserved classical learning and that were the primary vehicles of classical knowledge throughout the early medieval period. The 7-year bad luck belief was, in this transmission, an example of a widespread pattern, a Roman cultural belief surviving through the medieval period in popular practice long after its original philosophical context had been forgotten, retained because its practical content, be careful with mirrors, remained relevant even when the reasoning behind it was no longer explicitly articulated. The Roman natural historian Pliny the Elder, writing in his encyclopedic natural history in the 1st century CE, is one of our best sources for the classical world's understanding of the mirror and its relationship to the body. Pliny noted the widespread belief that the reflection showed more than the physical appearance, that it showed the health and spiritual condition of the person reflected, that changes in the reflected image could presage illness or death, that the destruction of the reflection had consequences for the person reflected. He was writing as a natural historian rather than as a theologian, and his account of these beliefs has the quality of careful observation without endorsement. He was reporting what people believed rather than asserting its truth. The Roman philosopher and statesman Cicero, in his work On Divination, engaged with the relationship between reflective surfaces and the soul in a philosophical rather than observational register. Cicero was skeptical of divination in general, but he was interested in the psychological and philosophical questions that mirror beliefs raised, questions about the relationship between the image and the original, between the visible and the invisible dimensions of the self, between what could be seen in a mirror and what the seen image meant about the unseen self. His skepticism about the literal truth of mirror beliefs did not prevent him from finding the beliefs philosophically interesting. The transmission of the 7-year belief from Roman thought into medieval and early modern European popular culture was mediated primarily by the encyclopedic traditions of late antiquity and the early medieval period, writers like Isidore of Seville, whose Etymologiae collected and preserved classical knowledge in forms accessible to the medieval world, and Pliny's own natural history, which was copied and read throughout the medieval period, even when only partially understood. The specific content of the mirror bad luck belief, the 7-year duration, the bodily renewal cycle, appears to have been transmitted through this encyclopedic tradition, rather than through any single text, accumulating as practical implications in popular belief while losing the explicit philosophical framework in which it had originally made sense. The number 7 had additional resonance in Roman culture and in the broader Greco-Roman Jewish cultural complex that formed the foundation of Western thought. 7 was the number of the known planets in ancient astronomy: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and each planet was associated with a day of the week and with specific qualities and influences. 7 was the number of completion and of cosmic order, the 7 days of creation in the Genesis account, the 7 seals of the Book of Revelation, the 7 wonders of the ancient world. To say that something lasted 7 years was to say that it lasted for a complete cosmic cycle, for the period that the universe itself required to fully renew and restore what had been disrupted. The medieval philosopher and theologian Albertus Magnus, writing in the 13th century, engaged with the mirror's properties in ways that connected the scholastic philosophical tradition to the popular beliefs about mirror breakage. Albertus was interested in what he called the active power of mirrors, their capacity not merely to reflect passively, but to act upon what they reflected in ways that the reflected object experiences real effects. He drew on classical sources, including Pliny and Aristotle, and also on contemporary accounts of optical experiments, to build an argument for the mirror as a genuinely active instrument rather than a purely passive one. His work helped to legitimize the idea that mirrors could affect what they reflected, an idea that the popular belief about mirror breakage had always assumed, but that the learned tradition had not always endorsed. The alchemical tradition's engagement with mirrors is another dimension of the learned relationship with mirror properties that influence the broader cultural attitude. Alchemists use mirrors both practically as concentrators of sunlight for heating reactions and symbolically as instruments of transformation, surfaces on which one kind of thing became another. The alchemical mirror was a symbol of the transformative process itself. The thing that entered the mirror as one kind of thing emerged as another, transformed by the passage through the reflective surface. This transformative understanding of the mirror, as a surface of change rather than simply of reflection, added another layer to the cultural complexity of mirror breakage. If mirrors transformed, then a broken mirror was a broken transformative instrument, and the transformation it had been performing was interrupted in unpredictable ways. The cultural transmission of the 7-year belief through nursery rhyme and children's verse is another underexplored dimension of its persistence. Like many pieces of folk wisdom that needed to be reliably transmitted across generations, the 7-year bad luck belief found its way into the rhyming rhythmic forms that children learned and remembered long before they understood what they were memorizing. The rhyme that warned about breaking a mirror was not a piece of adult superstition that children happened to overhear. It was often specifically directed at children, who were the household members most likely to break mirrors accidentally, and therefore the people most urgently in need of the warning. The form of the rhyme, like the form of all mnemonic verse, was chosen to make the content memorable, and the content it made memorable was both the prohibition and its consequence: 7 years of bad luck. What the Roman contribution added to the ancient soul reflection belief was precision. The ancient belief said, the reflection matters, be careful with it. The Roman specification said, if you damage it, the consequences last exactly 7 years, because that is how long your body takes to renew itself completely. The precision was memorable. The precision was transmissible. The precision was exactly what oral tradition needed to preserve a belief across generations without a written text to stabilize it, and the precision is why, 2,000 years after the Roman philosophers who developed it, we still say 7 years and not 6 or 8 or an indefinite period. The number stuck because the number had a reason, and the reason, though forgotten, left the number behind. When the Roman Empire contracted and the cultural framework that had given the 7-year belief its original logic dissolved, the belief did not disappear. It entered the medieval world in a new form, absorbed into a Christian cultural framework that gave it new meanings while preserving the essential structure of the old ones. The medieval Christian understanding of mirrors was deeply ambivalent. Mirrors were simultaneously useful tools and spiritually dangerous objects, simultaneously honest revealers of truth and instruments of vanity and self-deception. This ambivalence was not accidental. It reflected genuine complexity in the mirror's relationship to the dominant moral and theological concerns of medieval culture, and it produced a body of mirror symbolism that was among the richest and most elaborated in the history of the object. The speculum literature, the genre of medieval didactic writing that used the mirror as its central metaphor, gives us the positive side of medieval mirror symbolism. Speculum was the Latin word for mirror, and the medieval period produced an enormous body of text with titles in the form speculum followed by some quality or category. Speculum Humanae Salvationis, the mirror of human salvation. Speculum Virginum, the mirror of virgins. Vincent of Beauvai's vast encyclopedia, the Speculum Maius, the great mirror, and dozens of others. In all of these, the mirror served as a metaphor for the text itself, a mirror held up to reality that allowed the reader to see clearly what was really the case, to understand their situation accurately, to have the truth of their condition reflected back to them without distortion. This positive mirror symbolism depended on the mirror's capacity for accurate reflection, its quality of showing things as they were rather than as one might wish them to be. The honest mirror was a symbol of truth, of clear-sightedness, of the refusal to flatter or distort. The Virgin Mary was sometimes depicted holding a mirror without taint, speculum sine macula in the Latin, a symbol of her purity and her capacity to reflect divine truth without the distortions that human sinfulness introduced. The mirror as truth-teller was a powerful and widely used symbol, but the negative mirror symbolism was at least as pervasive and at least as elaborated. The mirror of vanity, speculum vanitatis, was one of the most consistent attributes of the allegorical figure of pride or vanity in medieval iconography. Pride was depicted holding a mirror and gazing at her own reflection, the mirror representing the self-absorption and self-admiration that the Christian tradition considered a fundamental spiritual error. The person who looked too long at their own reflection was a person who had made themselves the center of their moral universe, who had substituted self-love for the love of God that should have been primary. The mirror made vanity visible, and in making it visible condemned it. This association between mirror gazing and spiritual danger gave the breakage of a mirror an additional layer of moral significance in the medieval Christian context. If the mirror was an instrument of potential vanity and self-worship, then its destruction was not straightforwardly unfortunate. There was a sense in which the broken mirror was a corrective, a disruption of the dangerous fascination with one's own image, a shattering of the self-regard that the intact mirror had enabled. The bad luck that followed the breakage was therefore not simply a supernatural punishment for the careless handling of a precious object. It was, in the medieval reading, the continuation of the spiritual danger that the mirror had always represented, now in a different form, the danger of the soul disrupted by the loss of its reflection, rather than the danger of the soul corrupted by excessive contemplation of that reflection. The medieval understanding of the mirror as a portal, as a surface through which things could pass in both directions, through which the other world could become accessible to this one, built on ancient traditions of mirror divination and added to them the Christian framework of demonic and angelic influence. The mirror that reflected the soul could also, in the medieval understanding, be accessed by spiritual beings who might use it to make contact with the person reflected. This was the basis of the belief that it was dangerous to sleep near a mirror. The mirror, as a portal, might allow nocturnal visitors access to the sleeper's soul through the reflected image. The specific practices that developed around mirrors in the medieval period reflect this complex mixture of positive and negative associations. Mirrors were blessed at their manufacture. In some traditions, they were wrapped in cloth. When not in use, they were kept away from the sick and the dying. They were, in some households, placed with the reflective surface facing the wall rather than the room when the household was in mourning. All of these practices can be understood as attempts to manage the mirror's spiritual properties, to preserve the positive qualities of truth reflection while mitigating the negative qualities of vanity temptation and portal accessibility. The medieval contribution to the mirror bad luck tradition was to deepen and complicate the belief's moral and spiritual dimensions. The Roman tradition had given the belief its specific temporal form, the 7 years, and its bodily logic, the renewal cycle. The medieval tradition gave it a moral weight that the Roman tradition had lacked. The broken mirror was not merely a physical object destroyed, but a spiritual instrument disrupted, and the disruption had implications that reached beyond the merely physical into the moral and spiritual condition of the person whose soul had been reflected in it. The medieval speculum literature was not only concerned with the spiritual and moral dimensions of the mirror, it also engaged with the mirror's epistemological function, its capacity to show things that could not be seen directly, to provide a form of indirect vision that protected the viewer from the dangers of direct encounter. The myth of Perseus and Medusa, which the medieval writers inherited from the classical tradition, was frequently interpreted as a lesson about the proper use of indirect vision. Perseus could only safely observe Medusa through the reflection in his polished shield, because direct vision of Medusa's face was fatal. The mirror protected the hero from the deadly direct gaze by interposing a mediated, reflected image between the viewer and the viewed. This protective function of the mirror as indirect vision gave rise to a tradition of thinking about mirrors as instruments of safe observation, ways of seeing dangerous or forbidden things at one remove without the risks of direct encounter. The medieval tradition of using mirrors to observe solar eclipses safely, the mirror's reflection, allowing observation of the sun without the retinal damage that direct observation would cause, was understood in this context as continuous with the mythological use of the mirror as a protective mediator. The mirror protected the observer by interposing itself between the observer and the thing observed. The specifically Christian moral dimension of mirror symbolism in the medieval period was complicated by the ambiguity of the tradition it inherited. On one hand, the mirror was a symbol of truth, the honest mirror, the clear reflection, the object that showed things as they were. On the other hand, the mirror was a symbol of vanity, the instrument of self-love, the surface at which pride gazed admiringly. This double valence meant that the moral status of the mirror was never simply positive or negative, but always contextual. The mirror used for self-knowledge was virtuous. The mirror used for self-admiration was sinful. The distinction was not always easy to maintain in practice, which is part of what made the mirror such a morally charged object. By the end of the medieval period, the mirror bad luck belief had accumulated layers from at least 3 distinct sources: the ancient soul reflection belief, the Roman 7-year renewal cycle, and the medieval Christian moral framework around mirrors and vanity. These layers were not always consistent with each other. The traditions spoke in different registers and were not obviously reconcilable at the level of explicit theology, but they were consistent in their practical implication. Be careful with mirrors. The mirror matters. What happens to the mirror has consequences for the person reflected in it, and breaking it is not something to be taken lightly. The specific practices that the medieval period developed for the safe handling and disposal of broken mirror glass reflect the seriousness with which the breakage was treated. In some traditions, broken mirror glass was to be buried in the earth, specifically in earth that had not been consecrated, in the unconsecrated ground, at the edge of the churchyard, or in open field. The earth would absorb the spiritual contamination of the broken mirror, neutralize it, prevent it from continuing to operate as a source of misfortune. In other traditions, the broken glass was to be thrown into running water, a river, a stream, any moving water, so that the current would carry away the spiritual weight of the breakage. In still others, the glass was to be burned, or sealed in a vessel and buried, or thrown away at a crossroads, the traditional liminal point where negative forces could be dispersed. The medieval Christian tradition's anxiety about mirrors was not, however, a uniform condemnation of mirrors as objects. The same tradition that made the mirror a symbol of vanity also made it a symbol of the soul's capacity for divine reflection. The idea that the purified soul was like a polished mirror, capable of receiving and reflecting the divine light. The mystics of the period wrote about the spiritual life in terms that were explicitly mirror metaphorical. The soul's purification was like the polishing of a mirror. The soul's contemplation of the divine was like the mirror's reception of light. The soul's union with the divine was like the perfect coincidence of mirror and its reflection. These positive mirror metaphors coexisted with the negative vanity associations in the same tradition, creating an ambivalence that contributed to the mirror's exceptional cultural weight. The specific association between mirror breakage and romantic misfortune, the belief, documented in several European traditions, that breaking a mirror specifically augured the ending of a love affair or the failure of a hoped-for marriage, added a dimension to the general bad luck belief that was particularly resonant for the predominantly female users of the domestic mirror. The mirror was, in the household of the medieval and early modern period, primarily a female object, used for the self-presentation that was the woman's primary social responsibility in a way that it was not the man's. A woman's mirror was therefore intimately connected to her social and romantic prospects in a way that a man's mirror was not, and the breakage of that mirror was appropriately associated with the disruption of the prospects the mirror had been serving. The 7 years of bad luck in this gendered reading was 7 years of impaired capacity for the kind of self-presentation that the mirror had enabled. By the end of the medieval period, the mirror bad luck belief had accumulated layers from at least 3 distinct sources: the ancient soul reflection belief, the Roman 7-year renewal cycle, and the medieval Christian moral framework around mirrors and vanity. These layers were not always consistent with each other. The traditions spoke in different registers and were not obviously reconcilable at the level of explicit theology, but they were consistent in their practical implication. Be careful with mirrors. The mirror matters. What happens to the mirror has consequences for the person reflected in it, and breaking it is not something to be taken lightly. Among the most widespread practices associated with the mirror bad luck belief is one that might seem at first to be quite separate from it: the covering of mirrors in a house where someone has recently died. This practice, still observed today in Jewish mourning tradition as part of the Shiva ritual, still maintained in parts of rural Ireland and Scotland, still found in various forms across southern and eastern Europe, is among the most persistent pieces of mirror-related folk practice in the Western world. It predates the specific 7-year bad luck formulation. It exists independently of it, and it illuminates the soul mirror connection from an angle that the breakage superstition does not. The angle of the soul in transition, the moment when the ordinary relationship between the soul and its reflection is most fragilely constituted. The practice of covering mirrors at the time of death has been explained in several different ways by the traditions that maintain it, and the multiplicity of explanations is itself instructive about the depth and complexity of the belief system from which the practice emerges. Understanding all of the explanations, rather than settling on one, gives a much fuller picture of what the practice was for and why it has been so persistent. The first and oldest explanation is the one most directly connected to the soul reflection belief. The soul of the newly dead person in the old tradition does not immediately depart. It lingers for a period, variously specified as 3 days, 7 days, a year, or an indefinite period, in and around the place where the person died, gradually reorienting toward the afterlife and away from the life it has just left. During this lingering period, the soul is understood as still potentially visible in reflective surfaces, still capable of being seen by the living and of seeing the living. The mirror in a house of death is therefore a mirror that might reflect not only the living but the dead, and a soul that sees its own reflection at this transitional moment might be confused or held back, or in some versions of the belief actually trapped by the reflection, unable to move on to whatever comes after because its image is still present in the glass. The covering of mirrors protected the departing soul from this entrapment. It removed the reflective surfaces that might catch and hold the soul's image during the period when the soul was most vulnerable to being held. The mirror that was left uncovered during the mourning period was a mirror that might, in the tradition's understanding, become a prison for the soul that needed to be released, a prison from which no living person could free it, because the living could not see or interact with the soul in the ways that would be required. The second explanation is a protective one for the living rather than for the dead. The soul in transition was understood as more powerful and more potentially harmful than the settled soul of the living, because it was no longer constrained by the body and by the social and spiritual obligations that the body carried. A soul newly released from its body might, through the medium of the mirror, create a connection with one of the living people reflected in it, a connection that the soul had not sought and the living person had not consented to, but that the mirror's reflective properties made possible. The covered mirror protected the living from this inadvertent soul contact during the most spiritually intense period following a death. The third explanation is the one most explicitly connected to the bad luck tradition, the belief that seeing your own reflection in a mirror in a house of the dead would result in your own death in the near future. This belief, which appears in various forms across many European traditions, is a direct application of the idea that the mirror in the house of death is a portal to death, and that to be reflected in it is to have your soul's image drawn toward death in a way that makes your own death more likely. The covered mirror prevented this specific danger by simply removing the reflective surface from the environment entirely. The Jewish practice of covering mirrors during Shiva, the 7-day mourning period following a death, is one of the best documented examples of the practice, and it has generated considerable discussion about its origins and its meaning. Several explanations are given within the Jewish tradition itself, and they are remarkably similar to the non-Jewish explanations we have just examined. The mirrors are covered so that the mourners will not be distracted from their grief by concern for their appearance. They are covered because the presence of death makes the concern with personal appearance, the concern for the self-image that the mirror serves, inappropriate and even offensive. They are covered because the reflection of the mourners would be a painful reminder of the continuing life from which the dead person is now excluded. And they are covered, in some accounts, because the mirror might reflect or contain the soul of the newly dead. What all of these explanations share is the understanding of the mirror as a spiritually active object at the time of death, an object whose properties become particularly significant and particularly potentially dangerous precisely when death has entered the household. The mirror, that is normally a useful tool of self-presentation, becomes, in the context of death, a portal, a trap, a reminder of the self's mortality, a potential connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Covering it is a way of managing that activation, of acknowledging that the mirror's properties are real and potentially dangerous, while taking practical steps to limit their scope. The Jewish mourning practice of mirror covering during Shiva is documented as far back as the Talmudic period, though the specific explanations for it evolved over centuries of rabbinic commentary. The medieval rabbinic literature added to the practical mourning explanations a cosmological dimension. During the period of acute mourning, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, was understood as dwelling with the mourners, and mirrors, which were associated with physical beauty and self-presentation, were inappropriate in the presence of the divine. The removal of the mirrors was therefore not only a practical mourning practice, but a preparation of the space for the quality of divine presence that grief invited, The Irish tradition of covering mirrors following a death was documented extensively by 19th century folklorists collecting customs across rural Ireland, and the accounts they gathered reveal interesting regional variations on the basic practice. In some areas, only the mirrors in the room where the death had occurred were covered. In others, all mirrors in the house were covered for the full mourning period. In still others, mirrors were covered, but other reflective surfaces, polished metal, still water in a vessel, were also removed or obscured on the grounds that any reflective surface could serve the same function that the tradition attributed to mirrors. The variations suggest a living practice rather than a rigidly transmitted rule. People were applying the underlying principle as best they understood it, rather than simply following a fixed prescription. The Victorian practice of covering mirrors following a death was widespread enough to be commented upon by contemporary observers as a distinctively working-class custom, something that the educated and professional classes had largely abandoned, but that persisted in the households of the poor and the less formally educated. This characterization was not entirely accurate. The practice was maintained across social classes, though with different degrees of explicitness and different degrees of acknowledged belief in its supernatural rationale. The upper-class household that covered its mirrors might explain the practice in terms of aesthetic appropriateness. The house of mourning was not the place for the vanity that mirrors encouraged, while the working-class household might explain it in more directly supernatural terms. The practice was the same, the explanation was differently calibrated to the social context. The connection between the covering mirrors practice and the breakage superstition is a connection of underlying belief rather than of explicit logic. Both practices express the same fundamental understanding, that the mirror carries something of the soul, and that what happens to the mirror, whether it is broken or simply covered and made inactive, has implications for the soul it carries. The breakage superstition says, damage the mirror and you damage the soul connection, creating 7 years of spiritual vulnerability. The covering practice says, at the time of death, when the soul is most vulnerable, protect the mirror from use so that it cannot be used against the soul's safe passage. The specific timing of the mirror covering custom in relation to the moment of death varied in interesting ways across different traditions. In some communities, the mirrors were covered immediately upon the death, at the very moment the breath ceased, before the body was prepared or the news sent out. In others, the covering was done at the moment the body was removed from the house for burial. In still others, the mirrors remained uncovered until the night of the death and were then covered for the mourning period. These variations suggest that the underlying concern, the vulnerability of the soul at the moment of departure and in the immediate aftermath, was consistent, while the specific understanding of when that vulnerability was most acute varied by local tradition. The connection between the mirror covering practice and the broader tradition of covering or removing other reflective surfaces at the time of death illuminates the logic of the practice beyond the specific mirror case. In some traditions, polished metal vessels were also removed from the room of the dying. Still water in bowls or basins was poured out. Windows were covered, particularly those that looked east, toward the rising sun, the direction associated in many European traditions with both life and death, the direction from which the soul was understood to depart. The comprehensive removal of all reflective surfaces suggests that the concern was not specifically about mirrors as objects, but about the reflective property as such, about the capacity of any surface to hold and show an image, and that the mirror was simply the most socially significant instance of the general category. The liminal status of mirrors at the time of death was reinforced by the widespread folk belief that the newly dead could be confused about their condition, that the soul freshly released from the body might not immediately understand that it had died, might wander the house it had inhabited looking for confirmation of its own continued existence, and might seek that confirmation in the mirrors that had always shown it its face. A mirror that showed the dead person their own face was a mirror that told them they were still there, still embodied, still part of the living world they had actually left. The kindest thing in this understanding was to prevent the mirror from offering this false comfort, to remove the reflective surface that might mislead the departing soul into lingering when it should be moving on. The connection between the covering mirrors practice and the breakage superstition is a connection of underlying belief rather than of explicit logic. Both practices express the same fundamental understanding, that the mirror carries something of the soul, and that what happens to the mirror, whether it is broken or simply covered and made inactive, has implications for the soul it carries. The breakage superstition says, damage the mirror and you damage the soul connection, creating 7 years of spiritual vulnerability. The covering practice says, at the time of death, when the soul is most vulnerable, protect the mirror from use so that it cannot be used against the soul's safe passage. The mirror's association with bad luck was not its only supernatural association. In the tradition that ran alongside the protective folklore, and sometimes in tension with it, sometimes in collaboration with it, the mirror was also understood as a tool of power, a portal through which knowledge from beyond the ordinary world could be accessed, a surface through which the future and the distant could be perceived, an instrument in the hands of those who knew how to use it for seeing what ordinary vision could not see. Mirror divination, katoptromancy, from the Greek katopitron, mirror, is among the most ancient and most widely distributed of the divinatory arts. It appears in ancient Babylon, where polished metal surfaces were used by priests to receive visions and omens. It appears in ancient Greece, where the oracle at Patrai used a mirror lowered into a sacred spring to receive images of the future. It appears in the medieval Islamic world, where the practice of gazing into polished surfaces was a recognized divinatory technique with its own professional practitioners. It appears in Renaissance Europe, where the learned magicians of the period, Cornelius Agrippa, John Dee, Giambattista della Porta, wrote about the use of mirrors as instruments of vision and knowledge, and it appears in the folk traditions of Britain and Ireland, where the mirror was used by cunning folk and wise women, alongside more obviously rustic divinatory methods, as a tool for finding the lost, identifying the guilty, and foreseeing what was to come. The theoretical basis for mirror divination was the same as the theoretical basis for the soul reflection belief. The mirror's reflective surface was understood as permeable, as a boundary rather than a barrier, as a surface through which things could pass in both directions. The ordinary use of the mirror allowed things from the visible world to pass into the mirror's surface as reflections. The divinatory use of the mirror allowed things from the invisible world to pass back out through the mirror's surface as visions. The mirror was the medium of exchange between the two worlds, and the skilled practitioner was someone who understood how to use that medium in both directions. The specific techniques of mirror divination varied considerably across traditions, but certain features were consistent. Darkness or near darkness was typically required, a candle or a single lamp rather than full daylight, so that the mirror's surface showed more shadow than reflection, more depth than image. Prolonged gazing was required, not the quick glance of normal mirror use, but the sustained, focused, slightly unfocused attention that the tradition called the soft gaze directed at the mirror's surface without specifically looking at any particular feature of what was reflected, and a specific state of mind was required, a quieting of the ordinary rational consciousness, a relaxation of the critical faculties, an openness to what might appear in the glass that the analytical mind would normally process out of awareness. The psychological reality of what happened to sustained mirror gazers, the visual distortions, the apparent movements in the glass, the faces and forms that seem to appear in the depths of the reflection, has been studied in contemporary psychology and found to be both real and explicable without supernatural reference. The Troxler effect, in which sustained focus on a fixed point causes the surrounding visual field to fade and change, applies to mirror gazing. The face in the mirror, gazed at without moving attention, begins to shift and distort as the visual system loses its calibration. Giovanni Caputo's research on the strange face in the mirror illusion, which we discussed at some length in an earlier script in this series, demonstrated that most people, after a few minutes of gazing at their own face in a dim mirror, begin to see distortions, enlarged features, differently shaped faces, even the faces of entirely different people. The divinatory tradition was using these optical phenomena, which the practitioners experience as genuine visions rather than as visual artifacts, as a vehicle for accessing intuition and unconscious knowledge. The images that appeared in the mirror were interpreted in the same way that dreams were interpreted, as communications from a level of consciousness or reality that was not accessible through ordinary rational thought. The mirror, in this use, was a technology for bypassing the rational mind and accessing what lay behind or beneath it. Whether the access was genuinely to supernatural knowledge or to the contents of the unconscious depends on what framework you bring to the interpretation, but the access itself was real. The dark mirror, the black mirror, the obsidian surface, the mirror coated with black pigment specifically to eliminate the ordinary reflection and leave only depth, was the favoured tool of the most serious divinatory practitioners. John Dee's obsidian mirror, which he used to receive communications from angelic beings through the mediation of his scryer, Edward Kelly, was an example of this tradition. The black mirror's darkness was its advantage. Without an ordinary reflection to provide the visual anchoring that would prevent the Troxler effect from operating, the black mirror produced the visual indeterminacy that the divinatory tradition required much more quickly and more reliably than an ordinary reflective surface. The relationship between mirror divination and mirror bad luck is one of inverse but parallel logic. The breakage superstition said, the mirror's reflective surface is connected to the soul. Damaging that surface damages the soul. The divinatory tradition said, the mirror's surface is a portal to other knowledge. Using that surface correctly allows access to what the surface contains. Both beliefs depended on the same foundational premise, that the mirror was more than glass and silver, that its surface was permeable to things that physical optics could not account for, that what happened at the mirror's surface had implications beyond the merely visual. The breakage superstition was the negative expression of this premise. The divinatory tradition was the positive expression. The mirror's power could harm or help, depending on what was done with it and how. The tradition of hydromancy, divination through water surfaces, provided the earliest form of the mirror divination practice, predating the existence of polished metal mirrors by millennia. Still pools, bowls of dark water, the calm surface of a river at dawn, all of these served as the first mirrors in which humans saw their own reflections, and all of these were used for divinatory purposes in traditions across the ancient world. The transition from water to polished metal to polished glass was a technological refinement rather than a conceptual shift. The same understanding of the reflective surface as a portal between the ordinary world and the world of hidden knowledge persisted through all the changes in the specific material used. The connection between mirror divination and the crystal ball, the other primary instrument of Western scrying tradition, is instructive. The crystal ball and the dark mirror share the same essential operative principle, a surface or volume of material that, under the right conditions and with the right quality of attention, produces visual effects that the practitioner interprets as communications from beyond the ordinary world. The crystal ball's transparency and depth, the dark mirror's opacity and darkness produce different visual conditions, but the same basic perceptual phenomenon. A surface that does not simply reflect back the ordinary world, but that seems, under sustained and specific attention, to show something else. The use of mirrors in protective magic, as distinct from divinatory magic, provides another dimension of the tradition that is directly relevant to the bad luck superstition. In many folk magical traditions, mirrors were used to deflect negative energy, malevolent intention, or the evil eye back toward its source. A mirror placed above a doorway would reflect any ill-wishing directed at the household, back toward the person who had sent it, protecting the household while penalizing the sender. In this protective use, the mirror's reflective property was explicitly deployed as a weapon. What comes toward the mirror goes back from it, doubled or at least returned. The belief that breaking a mirror had negative consequences could be understood, in this framework, as the consequence of destroying a protective device. The broken mirror could no longer return ill-wishing to its source, leaving the household vulnerable to whatever negative energies the mirror had previously been deflecting. The relationship between mirror divination and mirror bad luck is one of inverse but parallel logic. The breakage superstition said the mirror's reflective surface is connected to the soul. Damaging that surface damages the soul. The divinatory tradition said the mirror's surface is a portal to other knowledge. Using that surface correctly allows access to what the surface contains. Both beliefs depended on the same foundational premise, that the mirror was more than glass and silver, that its surface was permeable to things that physical optics could not account for, that what happened at the mirror's surface had implications beyond the merely visual. The breakage superstition was the negative expression of this premise. The divinatory tradition was the positive expression. The dark mirror tradition received its most sustained and most philosophically sophisticated treatment in the work of the Renaissance magicians, specifically in the work of Cornelius Agrippa, Giambattista della Porta, and John Dee. These writers treated mirror divination not as folk superstition, but as a learned practice with genuine theoretical foundations, connected to their broader understanding of the sympathy between the macrocosmos and the microcosmos, between the heavens and the earth, between the spiritual and the material dimensions of reality. The mirror, in this learned tradition, was understood as an instrument for accessing the connections between things that ordinary perception could not directly observe, a technology for reading the invisible web of sympathies that organize the universe. The 20th century revival of interest in mirror divination, associated with the broader neo-pagan and occult revival that began in the 1950s and accelerated through the 1970s and 1980s, produced a new literature on the dark mirror and its uses that drew on both the historical tradition and contemporary psychological frameworks. Writers like Doreen Valiente and Israel Regardie, who were influential in the development of Wiccan and ceremonial magical practice, wrote about mirror scrying in ways that acknowledge both its historical pedigree and its psychological basis, that combine the traditional understanding of the mirror as a portal with a contemporary understanding of the mirror as a tool for accessing unconscious material. This synthesis was not entirely comfortable. The two frameworks did not entirely agree about what was happening in the mirror-gazing session, but it was productive, generating a body of contemporary practice that remained connected to the older tradition while speaking the language of its own time. The folk tradition's protective strategies around mirrors, the avoidance of looking into them in certain circumstances, the covering of them in houses of the dead, the care taken not to break them, can also be understood as a kind of inverse divinatory practice. If the mirror was a portal through which things could pass, then protecting the mirror from misuse was protecting the portal from being used against you. The careful handling of mirrors was the non-specialist version of the same concern that the professional scryer addressed through specific divinatory technique. The recognition that the mirror's surface was not neutral, that what happened there had implications, and that the implications deserved to be taken seriously. The 19th century presents one of the most interesting moments in the history of the mirror bad luck belief, because it is the period in which the belief existed in most explicit tension with the scientific worldview that was simultaneously consolidating its authority over educated opinion while failing to displace the folk practices and folk beliefs of the majority of the population. The Victorian period saw the mass production of silvered glass mirrors for the first time, making mirrors affordable across the social spectrum in a way they had never previously been. The working-class household of the 1880s might have several mirrors, a shaving mirror in the kitchen, a larger mirror in the bedroom, perhaps a small decorative mirror in the parlour, where its equivalent a century earlier would have had none or one. This democratization of the mirror meant that the mirror bad luck belief, which had previously applied primarily to the mirror-owning classes, became relevant to the entire population for the first time, and it also meant that mirrors were broken more frequently. When more people had more mirrors were broken, and more people encountered the specific cultural moment of looking down at the shards and wondering what it meant. The Victorian scientific tradition was, by the 1880s, well equipped to explain the optical physics of mirrors in terms that left no room for soul connections or 7-year bodily renewal cycles. The wave theory of light, the understanding of reflection as the regular bouncing of light waves from a smooth surface, the recognition that the image in the mirror was simply a visual phenomenon produced by the physics of reflection, all of this was well-established scientific knowledge by the mid-Victorian period, available to any educated person through the popular scientific literature that flourished in this era. The scientific explanation of the mirror left nothing spiritually significant in the reflection, and yet the bad luck belief persisted, not merely in the uneducated population, but in precisely the educated population that had access to the scientific explanation. Victorian diaries and letters reveal people of education and rationality acknowledging the mirror bad luck belief in their personal writing, sometimes to dismiss it, sometimes to note with mild embarrassment that they felt something when they broke a mirror, sometimes to record taking specific precautions in the aftermath of a breakage that they acknowledged were irrational, but that they performed nonetheless. The belief was not simply a product of ignorance that education dissolved. It was something more resilient than that. The Victorian folklorists, who began to collect and systematize folk beliefs in this period, approached the mirror bad luck tradition with a characteristic mixture of scholarly curiosity and mild condescension. William Henderson's folklore of the Northern Counties of England and the Borders, published in 1866, included extensive notes on mirror beliefs and practices. Edward Tyler's Primitive Culture of 1871, which established the academic discipline of anthropology, used mirror beliefs as evidence for his theory of animism, the survival in popular belief of a primitive religious stage in which inanimate objects were believed to have souls. For Tyler, the mirror bad luck belief was an evolutionary relic, an animistic belief that had survived into an era that ought to have outgrown it. The spiritualist movement, which flourished in the Victorian period alongside and in tension with the scientific rationalism, preserved and elaborated the mirror's supernatural associations in a new idiom. Victorian spiritualism used mirrors and other reflective surfaces as instruments for communicating with the dead, for receiving visions of the departed, for scrying as the older tradition had scryed. The seance room often contained a mirror or a crystal ball as a focal point for mediumistic activity, and the spiritualist literature of the period was full of accounts of mirrors that showed more than they should, mirrors in which the faces of the dead appeared, mirrors in which visions of distant events were perceived, mirrors that cracked or clouded spontaneously as signs of spiritual disturbance. The Victorian psychological tradition, the emerging discipline of psychology that was in this period separating itself from philosophy and beginning to accumulate empirical data, contributed a new language for understanding the mirror's significance without necessarily reducing it to mere superstition. The concept of the unconscious, which was being developed in this period by various thinkers before receiving its most systematic formulation in Freud's work, provided a framework within which the mirror's power over the human mind could be understood in psychological rather than supernatural terms. The mirror activated something in the psyche that went beyond the purely visual. The reflection engaged levels of self-awareness and self-representation that the ordinary surfaces of social life did not reach. The superstition was, in this reading, a symbolic expression of a genuine psychological truth about the mirror's unique relationship to selfhood. The 7-year bad luck belief specifically received its first serious academic attention in the Victorian period, when folklorists attempted to trace its origins and to understand the Roman biological theory that had generated the specific duration. The tracing was never complete. The transmission from Roman thought to folk practice was too long and too dispersed to be reconstructed with confidence. But the attempt was made, and the Roman 7-year renewal theory was identified as the likely original source. This identification gave the belief a historical dignity that distinguished it from mere arbitrary superstition. It was the survival of an ancient biological theory in popular practice, a piece of classical learning preserved in the beliefs of ordinary people who had never read Pliny. The specific form of the mirror, bad luck, counter-charm, most widely documented in Victorian Britain, was the throwing of broken pieces over the left shoulder, the left being the sinister side in folk belief, the side associated with ill luck and supernatural danger, the side from which malevolent influences arrived. By throwing the broken glass in the direction of ill luck, the performer was symbolically sending the bad luck back to where it came from, acknowledging the disruption while refusing to passively absorb its consequences. Other documented countercharms included burying the glass in the earth, touching wood immediately after the breakage, making the sign of the cross, and completing a specific verbal formula that acknowledged the breakage and asked for its consequences to be mitigated. The Victorian collector of folklore notes that mirror-related beliefs were among the most widely distributed of all the folk beliefs he encountered, more widely known and more widely held than many beliefs that seemed, from the educated perspective, more obviously explicable and more obviously rational. This distribution across social classes and educational levels was itself a piece of evidence about the belief's character. It was not simply a residual survival in less educated communities, not simply the persistence of pre-modern belief in the absence of scientific education. It was a belief that somehow survived and thrived even in the presence of scientific knowledge that ought, in principle, to have dissolved it. The photograph, which became widely available in the Victorian period and which shared with the mirror the function of producing an image of a person, attracted some of the same folk beliefs and folk anxieties that had previously attached to mirrors. The early superstition that being photographed took something from the person photographed, captured the soul, diminished the vitality, created a supernatural connection between the person and the image, was a direct transfer of the mirror superstition onto the new photographic medium. If the mirror image was soul adjacent, then perhaps the photographic image was also soul adjacent, perhaps more permanently and more completely so, given that the photograph persisted while the mirror image disappeared when the person moved away. The Victorian anxiety about photography was, in part, the mirror anxiety in a new form. What the Victorian period ultimately demonstrates about the mirror bad luck belief is the belief's remarkable resilience in the face of explanatory challenge. Scientific optics explain the mirror's mechanism. Rational philosophy questioned the soul-reflection connection. Educated culture mocked the 7-year superstition, and the belief persisted anyway, not as a doctrine held by people who believed it literally, but as a felt response, a residual something, a moment of hesitation in the face of a broken mirror that the rational mind could acknowledge was irrational, while the emotional and imaginative mind continued to experience it as real. The relationship between the mirror and the developing science of photography in the Victorian period was not only a matter of shared anxiety about image-soul connections, it was also a matter of technical history. The earliest photographic processes were developed by people who were deeply familiar with optical instruments, including mirrors and lenses, and who understood photography as a development of the long tradition of optical image making rather than as a wholly new departure. The camera obscura, which had been used by artists for centuries to project images of the external world onto a surface for tracing, was a form of mirror and lens system, and the earliest photographers were in many cases people who had been working with camera obscuras and related instruments. The Victorian craze for spirit photography, the practice of taking photographs that purportedly showed the presence of ghosts alongside the living subjects, is relevant to the mirror bad luck tradition because it reflects the same underlying anxiety about what images of people contained. If mirrors might contain the soul's image, might photographs also contain something of the soul? Might a photograph, taken at the moment of death or in the presence of the recently dead, capture something of the soul's departure? Spirit photographers claimed exactly this, that their photographs showed, in the form of misty shapes or shadowy presences around the main subjects, the souls of the dead who had been present at the moment of exposure. The photographs were in most cases fraudulent, but the belief they exploited was genuine, the extension of the mirror's soul reflection power to the photograph's image capturing power. The Victorian genre of the sensation novel, with its characteristic concerns about hidden identities, concealed pasts, and the gap between social appearance and psychological reality, used the mirror as a recurring symbol of the revealed truth that the plot eventually disclosed. The sensation novel's heroines frequently encountered mirrors at moments of crisis. The mirror that showed the heroine her own face In circumstances that made her recognize something she had not previously known about herself, the mirror that revealed the villain's true expression, when the villain believed himself unobserved, the mirror at the moment of confrontation between the false social self and the true psychological self. These literary mirrors were doing exactly what the bad luck tradition always said mirrors did, showing more than the surface, revealing what lay behind the presented face. What the Victorian period ultimately demonstrates about the mirror bad luck belief is the belief's remarkable resilience in the face of explanatory challenge. Scientific optics explain the mirror's mechanism. Rational philosophy questioned the soul-reflection connection. Educated culture mocked the 7-year superstition. And the belief persisted anyway, not as a doctrine held by people who believed it literally, but as a felt response, a residual something, a moment of hesitation in the face of a broken mirror that the rational mind could acknowledge was irrational, while the emotional and imaginative mind continued to experience it as real. The mirror bad luck belief did not exist only in folk practice and household custom. It also existed in the literary and artistic imagination, which gave it new forms and new meanings while preserving and elaborating its essential character. The mirror in Western literature has one of the longest and richest symbolic histories of any object in the imaginative tradition. From the myth of Narcissus, who died gazing at his own reflection in a pool, to the wicked queen's magic mirror in Snow White, from Through the Looking-Glass to the picture of Dorian Gray, the mirror in literature has consistently served as a threshold, a revelation, and a danger, the object through which the self encounters something about itself that the ordinary surfaces of social life conceal, and the encounter is rarely comfortable. The Narcissus myth, told most fully by Ovid in the Metamorphoses, is the foundational Western mirror story, and it encodes the mirror bad luck connection at the deepest possible level. Narcissus, warned by the prophet Tiresias that he would live long provided he never came to know himself, encounters his own reflection in a woodland pool and falls in love with it, believing it to be another being. His eventual recognition that what he loves is himself, that the other is identical with the self, produces not liberation, but destruction. He wastes away beside the pool, unable to leave the reflection, unable to possess what it shows him, dying of the contemplation that should have been merely self-knowledge. The pool's reflection was the instrument of his undoing, as the mirror in the bad luck tradition was the instrument of misfortune, not because the reflection was malevolent, but because the encounter with the self in the reflection was more than the self could safely sustain. The magic mirror of fairy tale, the queen's mirror in Snow White, the mirror on the wall that tells who is fairest of them all, is the mirror's oracle, the object that tells truth regardless of what the listener wishes to hear, that operates outside social convention and social courtesy, that reflects the real rather than the polite. This mirror is dangerous not because it lies, but because it tells the truth. And the truth it tells makes the listener's relationship to the world untenable. The Queen's mirror does not break in the conventional sense of the folk superstition, but the danger it creates, the danger of knowing too much about oneself in relation to others, is the mirror bad luck belief in a different register, the mirror as a source of dangerous, self-disrupting knowledge. Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking-Glass, published in 1871, uses the mirror as a portal to an alternative world, a world that is exactly reversed, where left is right and right is left, where time runs backward, where the ordinary logic of the waking world does not apply. Alice's passage through the mirror is a passage into the inverse of everything she knows, a confrontation with the way the world would be if its fundamental assumptions were turned around. Carroll was drawing on the mirror's long-standing association with the other world, with the space behind the reflection that the folk tradition had always understood as more than empty glass. But he was also drawing on the specific Victorian anxiety about what the mirror really showed, about whether the reflected world was the real world, or whether the ordinary world was itself the reflection of something more real on the other side. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, published in 1890, engages with the mirror bad luck tradition through the inverse logic of the portrait. In Wilde's story, it is not the mirror, but the painted portrait that carries the damage that should have expressed itself on the body. As Dorian remains forever young and beautiful, his portrait ages and corrupts, bearing the mark of his moral deterioration. The portrait is a mirror in reverse. Instead of the mirror showing the soul's condition in the reflected face, the portrait shows the soul's condition in the painted face, while the actual face remains unmarked. Wilde's novel is a sustained meditation on what the soul mirror belief means, on the relationship between the visible surface and the inner reality, on the danger of a self that is not accountable to any reflecting surface, on what happens when the connection between the image and the soul is severed rather than maintained. The Bram Stoker detail, Count Dracula casting no reflection, is one of the most famous deployments of the mirror bad luck tradition in Victorian literature. Stoker was drawing on the well-established folk belief that the reflection was connected to the soul. A being without a soul would have no reflection, because there was no soul for the mirror's surface to manifest. Dracula's mirrorlessness was simultaneously a visual sign of his supernatural nature, and a moral statement about his condition. He had no soul, and the mirror's testimony confirmed it. The mirror was the soul's witness, and its silence in the presence of Dracula was the silence of a witness who had nothing to report. The pre-Raphaelite painters engaged with the mirror bad luck tradition's imagery through their characteristic fascination with reflection, with the surfaces of things, with the relationship between the visible and the hidden. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's paintings of women gazing into mirrors have a quality of suspended time and spiritual intensity that connects them directly to the Victorian anxiety about what the mirror showed, whether the self it reflected was the true self or a distortion, whether what was gained in the mirror's revelation was worth what was risked in the exposure. The mirror in classical mythology provided a rich vocabulary for the literary tradition's engagement with the mirror bad luck theme. Beyond Narcissus, the most significant classical mirror story for subsequent literary tradition was the myth of Perseus and the Medusa, the story in which the polished shield served as a mirror that allowed Perseus to see Medusa without being directly exposed to her deadly gaze. This myth established the mirror as a protective, mediating device, a surface through which dangerous truths could be approached safely. The shield mirror in the Perseus myth was the instrument of both knowledge and protection. It showed what needed to be seen without exposing the viewer to the consequences of direct looking. The literary mirror, in many of its most powerful deployments, serves the same function. It shows truth at one remove, truth that would be too dangerous or too disturbing to encounter face to face. The portrait tradition in European painting, the tradition of the commissioned portrait as a record of a specific person's appearance and status, shares its deep logic with the mirror bad luck superstition in ways that painters and patrons of the Renaissance and later periods were well aware of. The portrait was understood as capturing something of the person it depicted, as creating a connection between the painted image and the living original that went beyond mere resemblance. The deterioration of a portrait was taken, in some traditions, as an omen of the original's deterioration. The damage of a portrait was understood as potentially damaging to the person depicted. These beliefs were the portrait version of the mirror, bad luck, superstition. The same underlying logic of the soul-image connection applied to a different kind of image. The 19th century invention of photography added another chapter to the mirror image soul story that the literary tradition had been exploring. The daguerreotype and its successors produced images of people that were permanent in a way that mirror images had never been. Images that persisted after the original was gone, that showed the person exactly as they had been at a specific moment in time, that could be reproduced and circulated and encountered by people who had never known the original. This permanence and reproducibility raised new questions about the relationship between the image and the original that the literary tradition quickly seized upon. Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, in which the portrait takes on the soul's deterioration that the face refuses, was in part a meditation on the new possibilities of permanent, reproducible image-making that photography represented. The literary and artistic tradition's engagement with the mirror, bad luck belief was not simply a continuation of the folk tradition in a new medium. It was a transformation of the tradition, a deepening and complication of its essential insights through the resources of individual imagination and literary craft. The folk tradition said, "Be careful with mirrors. The reflection matters. Breaking it has consequences." The literary tradition asked, why? What is it about the reflection that makes it matter? What is at stake in the encounter with one's own image? What does the mirror know that the face itself cannot tell us? The specific use of the shattered mirror as a plot device in horror fiction and horror film is a direct inheritance of the literary tradition's engagement with the mirror bad luck belief, and the persistence of this device across more than a century of horror storytelling testifies to the belief's continuing cultural resonance. The mirror that breaks just before something terrible happens, the mirror that shows something wrong with the reflection before the horror manifests in reality, the mirror that is avoided by the supernatural creature because it would reveal the creature's true nature. These are among the most consistent and most reliable devices of the genre, precisely because they tap directly into the ancient intuition that the mirror shows more than the surface, that what happens in the mirror has implications for what will happen in the world, and that the disruption of the mirror is a sign of deeper disruption to come. The specific horror of the Hall of Mirrors, the funfair attraction in which multiple mirrors reflect the visitor's image in multiple distorted forms simultaneously, engages with the mirror bad luck tradition's deepest anxiety. The fragmentation and distortion of the self-image. The Hall of Mirrors is frightening, not because the mirrors are broken, but because the multiplied distorted reflections deny the viewer the unified coherent self-image that the ordinary mirror provides. The self becomes multiple, becomes strange, becomes unrecognizable, and this unrecognizability activates the same fear that the broken mirror activates, the fear of the self without a stable, reliable image, the fear of the soul without its reflection. The specific tradition of the Tain Bo Cualnge, the great Irish cattle raid epic, contains an interesting mirror reference that connects the Celtic literary tradition to the broader mirror bad luck theme. The hero Cuchulain's distorted battle rage is described in terms that include the face becoming unrecognizable, the self becoming something other than the ordinary social self, a transformation that the text makes visible to the witnesses of the rage, but that the transformed warrior himself cannot see. The mirror that would show Cuchulainn his own battle-transformed face would be a mirror that showed him something that was simultaneously himself and not himself, the ordinary self and the battle self, simultaneously visible in the same glass. The bad luck tradition's shattered mirror, with its fragmented and distorted versions of the face, is a domestic version of this same confrontation with the self's multiplicity. The literary and artistic tradition's engagement with the mirror, bad luck belief was not simply a continuation of the folk tradition in a new medium. It was a transformation of the tradition, a deepening and complication of its essential insights through the resources of individual imagination and literary craft. The folk tradition said, "Be careful with mirrors, the reflection matters, breaking it has consequences." The literary tradition asked, why? What is it about the reflection that makes it matter? What is at stake in the encounter with one's own image? What does the mirror know that the face itself cannot tell us? The answers the literary tradition gave to these questions enrich the folk tradition's practical wisdom with a depth of psychological and philosophical exploration that the folk tradition could not itself provide. The mirror, bad luck belief has now been with us for at least 2,000 years. It has survived the collapse of the Roman Empire, the transformation of European culture by Christianity, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the digital age. It has survived everything that human history has thrown at it, including very prolonged and very direct rational challenge. And it is still here, not as an official doctrine, not as a formally maintained institution, but as a felt response, a moment of something when the mirror breaks, a residual awareness that has outlasted every explicit reason for it to exist. Understanding why the belief persists requires understanding something about the psychology of superstition, about what superstitious beliefs do for the people who hold them, about what function they serve, about why rational challenge alone is rarely sufficient to dissolve them. The psychological literature on superstition identifies several functions that superstitious beliefs reliably serve. The first, and perhaps most fundamental, is the function of providing explanatory frameworks for events that would otherwise seem random and meaningless. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We are constitutionally uncomfortable with the idea that events happen without cause or meaning, that bad things occur because of chance, rather than because of something that could have been predicted or controlled. Superstitious beliefs give us patterns where randomness would otherwise be visible. The mirror broke, and therefore the bad luck that followed was connected to the breakage, was caused by it, was not random but predictable in retrospect, and therefore potentially predictable in advance. The second function is control, or rather, the experience of control in circumstances where actual control is limited. If breaking a mirror causes 7 years of bad luck, then the bad luck is not simply inflicted upon you without warning or remedy. You caused it, and causing it means that you could have avoided it, and not having avoided it means that you can at least recognize the causal chain and take steps to manage the consequences, performing counter-charms, exercising extra caution, paying attention to the signs of bad luck manifesting. The superstition converts passive victimhood into active, if fictional, agency. The third function is social, the maintenance of shared cultural identity and shared cultural practice. Superstitions are typically social phenomena rather than private ones. They are shared beliefs, observed in recognizable ways, discussed in common language. The mirror, bad luck belief is something you can mention to a stranger and receive immediate recognition in return. It connects you to a community of shared understanding, a community that extends across generations and across social classes and across much of the Western world. Holding the belief, even holding it lightly, even acknowledging its irrationality while still feeling it, is a way of participating in a cultural inheritance that feels meaningful precisely because it is shared. The fourth function, and the one most directly relevant to the mirror specifically, is the function of managing the encounter with the self. The mirror is the one object in ordinary domestic life that consistently confronts us with our own image, with the face we wear in the world, the visible surface of the self. This confrontation is rarely entirely neutral. The mirror shows us not simply our physical appearance, but our physical appearance at a specific moment in time, in a specific condition, subject to aging and illness, and the effects of how we have been living. The mirror is honest in a way that the social world is not, and its honesty is sometimes more than we wanted. The belief that breaking a mirror brings bad luck can be understood in this psychological framework as a way of managing the anxiety that the mirror's honesty creates. The broken mirror, which has shattering, multiplied, distorted the self-image, is a visible symbol of the self's vulnerability, its fragility, its subjection to forces that can disrupt and destroy the image we maintain of ourselves. The 7 years of bad luck is the superstition's way of giving this anxiety a name and a duration. The self is disrupted. The disruption will take time to heal, and during that time we can expect things to be harder than usual. This is not comfortable knowledge, but it is preferable to the alternative, the unnarratable anxiety of having seen the self shatter and not knowing what it means. The philosopher William James's concept of the will to believe is useful here. James argued that in circumstances where belief could not be determined by rational evidence alone, and where the belief had practical consequences for how one lived, the choice to believe was itself a rational act, not because the belief was proven true, but because the belief enabled a way of living that was better than the alternative. The mirror bad luck belief, in James's framework, is the will to believe that disruptions of the self-image have consequences and timelines, that the disruption is not random, not permanent, not entirely beyond one's comprehension or management. The cognitive science of superstition, the study of how superstitious beliefs are formed, maintained, and transmitted at the level of cognitive processes, has produced findings that are directly relevant to the mirror bad luck belief's persistence. Research on magical thinking conducted by psychologists, including Paul Rosen and Carol Nemiroff, has identified a set of cognitive principles that generate superstitious beliefs cross-culturally and that persist in the face of rational challenge. One of the most relevant is the law of contagion, the belief that things that have been in contact continue to influence each other after the contact has ended. The mirror that has reflected a person is, in the cognitive sense, in contact with that person, and damage to the mirror therefore feels as though it should have consequences for the person, in the same way that damage to an object owned by someone feels as though it should affect the owner. The law of similarity, the belief that things that resemble each other influence each other, that an image of a person has a causal connection to the person imaged, is equally relevant. The mirror image resembles the person so completely, so precisely, so in every detail, that the cognitive tendency to treat similar things as connected is activated at full force. The reflection is not just similar to the person, it is, in its resemblance, more like the person than virtually any other object in the world. The similarity law therefore applies with unusual intensity, making the intuition that what happens to the reflection has implications for the person very difficult to suppress, even for people who explicitly understand that the reflection is simply an optical phenomenon with no causal connection to the original. The temporal dimension of the bad luck belief, the 7 years, has its own cognitive function that is worth examining. The specificity of the duration creates what psychologists call an availability heuristic opportunity. For 7 years following a mirror breakage, any misfortune that occurs can be attributed to the broken mirror. The causal link between the breakage and the subsequent misfortune is readily available as an explanation for whatever bad things happen, and the human mind's preference for causal explanation over coincidence means that this explanation will be frequently invoked. The 7 years of bad luck is, in cognitive terms, a 7-year window during which the mirror's explanatory power over negative events is activated, and given that misfortune of some kind will inevitably occur within any 7-year period, the belief in the mirror's causal role will be regularly confirmed. The persistence of the mirror bad luck belief across rational challenge is finally a testimony to the belief's psychological sophistication. It is not a crude belief, not a belief that mistakes optics for soul work in a simple and easily corrected way. It is a belief that has found its way into the emotional and imaginative life of the people who hold it at a level below explicit propositional commitment, a level at which rational challenge is not quite the right tool, because the belief is not primarily held as a proposition. It is held as a feeling, a response, a moment of something in the face of the shattered glass. The evolutionary psychology approach to superstition suggests that beliefs like the mirror, bad luck tradition persist because they were or are adaptive, because the behavioral tendency they support is, in at least some environments, better for the organism than the absence of that tendency. The tendency to treat broken mirrors as dangerous, to handle them carefully, to be cautious about mirror use in circumstances of illness or death. These behaviours may have had genuine adaptive value in environments where mirrors were expensive, where broken glass was hazardous, and where the careful handling of reflective surfaces required the kind of attentive, superstition-supported behaviour that the belief provided. The superstition was, in this reading, a heuristic, a rule of thumb that produced good enough behaviour, often enough to be worth maintaining, even at the cost of occasionally irrational anxiety. The social psychology of superstition transmission, the question of how beliefs like the mirror bad luck belief spread through populations and maintain themselves against challenge, is illuminated by the mirror belief's specific characteristics. The belief is memorable. 7 years is a specific, quotable, easily transmitted number, far more memorable than an indefinite bad luck period. The belief is dramatic. The crash of a breaking mirror is a sensory event that demands a response, and the belief provides a response that is proportional to the drama of the event. And the belief is unfalsifiable in practice, since misfortune of some kind will occur within any 7-year period. The belief can never be definitively disproven by personal experience. These characteristics combine to make the belief almost perfectly suited for cultural transmission. Memorable, emotionally resonant, and immune to disconfirmation. The relationship between the mirror bad luck belief and the specific rituals of luck management that developed around it also reveals something important about how folk cultures understood the relationship between misfortune and agency. The existence of countercharms, the salt over the shoulder, the spinning of the mirror's base, the burial of the glass, implied that the bad luck was not entirely predetermined, that it could be mitigated or redirected or partially neutralized by correct ritual action. This implied agency was itself a function of the belief. It gave the person who had broken the mirror something to do with the anxiety the breakage had created, a ritual action that acknowledged the disruption while also asserting the human capacity to respond to it. The superstition did not leave the person helpless. It gave them tools, however fictional their efficacy, for managing the disruption they had created. The persistence of the mirror bad luck belief across rational challenge is finally a testimony to the belief's psychological sophistication. It is not a crude belief, not a belief that mistakes optics for soul work in a simple and easily corrected way. It is a belief that has found its way into the emotional and imaginative life of the people who hold it at a level below explicit propositional commitment, a level at which rational challenge is not quite the right tool because the belief is not primarily held as a proposition. It is held as a feeling, a response, a moment of something in the face of the shattered glass. And feelings, responses, moments of something, these are not simply dissolved by being told that the physics of reflection does not involve souls. We have followed the mirror bad luck belief across 4,000 years of human history, from the Egyptian concept of the car to the Roman 7-year renewal cycle, from the medieval moralists who saw the mirror as an instrument of vanity to the Victorian folklorists who saw it as a relic of animistic thought, from the literary mirrors of Narcissus and Dorian Gray to the psychological frameworks that illuminate what the belief does for the people who hold it. Now it is time to ask the final question. What remains? What does the mirror bad luck belief mean for a world that has both lost its original framework and retained its residual feeling? More than might be expected remains. The mirror bad luck belief is not a dead belief, preserved only in academic study and historical curiosity. It is a living belief held in the attenuated but genuine form of a felt response, the moment when the mirror breaks and something in the mind that is not quite rational concern, but is not quite nothing, either responds to the event as though it were more than a domestic accident. This felt response is held by people who would not, if asked, claim to believe in the soul reflection connection or the Roman 7-year renewal cycle. They hold it without subscribing to its original theological or philosophical framework, which has long since dissolved. They hold it as a cultural habit, a residual intuition, a piece of inherited awareness that has outlasted the reasons for it. The persistence of the felt response tells us something important about how cultural beliefs work, about the difference between the explicit, propositional content of a belief and its emotional and imaginative dimensions. The explicit content of the mirror, bad luck belief, that reflections carry the soul, that the soul's image has a 7-year renewal cycle, that damaging the image damages the soul, is not something that most contemporary people would endorse in explicit propositional terms. But the emotional and imaginative content, the sense that the mirror shows something significant, that its breakage is more than a physical event, that the shattered self-image has some relationship to the self that is doing the looking. This persists with considerable vigor. The contemporary relevance of the mirror bad luck belief extends beyond the specific moment of breakage into the broader cultural relationship with mirrors and reflection. The selfie camera and the social media profile have created new forms of mirror, new surfaces in which the self is reflected and through which the self is presented to the world, and the anxieties these new mirrors generate have a recognizable family resemblance to the anxieties the old mirror superstition was managing. Body dysmorphia, the psychological condition in which the person's perception of their own appearance is severely distorted, often centers specifically on the mirror and on the disparity between what the mirror shows and what the sufferer believes others see. The mirror's ability to produce distorted or unwelcome self-knowledge, its capacity to confront the viewer with more truth than they wanted, or with a truth they find unbearable, is not less powerful in the digital age than it was in the Renaissance. It has simply found new forms. The specific number 7 retains its cultural weight in contexts far removed from mirrors and souls. 7 remains the number most widely cited in psychological studies as the number people associate with luck, with mystical significance, with the sense of something special. The 7-year itch, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 wonders of the world, the 7th son of a 7th son. 7 continues to carry the weight that the ancient world gave it, the weight of completion and cosmic significance. The mirror bad luck belief is, in this context, a carrier of the number's cultural power, a vehicle through which the ancient significance of 7 is transmitted into a secular age in a form that requires no explicit theological commitment. The counter-charms that the tradition developed to mitigate the bad luck following mirror breakage, throwing the broken pieces over the left shoulder, burying the glass in the earth, touching a piece of wood, completing a ritual that acknowledges the breakage and symbolically closes the account, are still practiced by some people with varying degrees of seriousness in ways that reflect the belief's contemporary status. These counter-charms are performed with an awareness that they are not literally efficacious in the causal sense, and also with a sense that performing them is somehow appropriate, that the ritual acknowledgement of the mirror's breakage does something that simply sweeping up the glass and moving on does not do. The ritual is a form of taking the event seriously, of acknowledging that something happened here that deserves more than practical management. The mirror bad luck belief also endures in the language, in the way that we speak about reflection, about self-image, about the relationship between the visible surface and the inner reality. When we say that someone has a good self-image, or a distorted self-image, or that an experience shattered their self-image, we are using the mirror's language to describe psychological states. We are treating the self as something that has an image that can be seen and assessed and potentially damaged in ways that are directly continuous with the ancient belief in the soul reflection connection. The belief that the image and the soul were connected, that what happened to the image had implications for the soul. The great lesson of the mirror, bad luck belief, traced through its long history, is perhaps this, that the objects we use to see ourselves are not neutral. The mirror that shows us our face shows us something more than our face, shows us our face as something that can be seen, which is the beginning of self-consciousness, shows us our face as something that changes over time, which is the beginning of awareness of mortality, shows us our face as something that others see differently from how we experience it from the inside, which is the beginning of the gap between self and self-image that lies at the root of so much human anxiety. The mirror is genuinely significant, not because it contains the soul in any literal sense, but because it is one of the primary instruments through which the self comes to know itself as a self, as something that has an image, that can be seen, that exists in relation to the world and to other selves. When the mirror breaks, the instrument of self-knowledge is disrupted. The image that it showed shatters into pieces, each of which shows a fragment of the face rather than the whole. The fragments do not reassemble. The wholeness of the reflection is gone, and something in us, not the part that understands physics, but the part that understands what the mirror was for, registers that disruption as a loss of something that mattered in a way that the physics of reflection cannot quite account for. 7 years of bad luck, a superstition, an old belief without a rational foundation, and yet the moment of looking down at the shards, the brief, quickly suppressed awareness that something has happened that is more than a domestic accident, that moment is real. It has always been real, and the long tradition that gave it a name and a duration was not simply wrong about the mirror. It was right about something that optics cannot fully describe. The contemporary counter-charm traditions around broken mirrors, the various rituals that people perform to mitigate the bad luck following a breakage, reveal the living character of the belief in ways that purely academic study cannot. People who break mirrors today, in the 21st century, frequently know the counter-charms, even when they couldn't say where they learned them or whether they believe them in any literal sense. Throw the pieces over your left shoulder. Bury the glass in the earth. Touch wood immediately. Wait for moonlight, then gather the pieces. These instructions are transmitted informally in the same way that the 7-year belief itself is transmitted, not through formal instruction or explicit teaching, but through cultural osmosis, through the half-serious advice offered at the moment of breakage, through the general cultural awareness that some kind of acknowledgement is appropriate, even if the specific form of that acknowledgement is not prescribed. The relationship between the mirror bad luck belief and the contemporary culture of self-image is rich and sometimes uncomfortable. In an era when self-presentation, the management of how one appears in images, has become a central cultural preoccupation, when the selfie camera and the social media profile have made image management into a full-time concern for many people, the old anxiety about what happens to the image when the mirror breaks has a new and very immediate relevance. The image that we curate and present and protect online is a kind of mirror image, a reflection of the self that we offer to the world in lieu of the self itself, and the disruption of that image, the negative comment, or the unflattering photograph, or the account hacked, produces responses that are recognizably continuous with the old mirror anxiety, the sense that something intimate has been damaged, that the self-image and the self are not entirely separable, that what happens to the one has implications for the other. The mirror bad luck belief in its most contemporary form is perhaps simply this, that attention matters, that the objects we use to see ourselves deserve a degree of care and respect that pure instrumentalism does not capture, that the mirror, whatever else it is the instrument through which we know ourselves as beings who have a face, who can be seen, who exist in relation to others and to the world, and that this knowledge and the instrument that provides it is worth handling with some care. This is not the soul reflection belief in its ancient form. It is the soul reflection belief stripped of its supernatural metaphysics and reduced to its ethical and psychological core. And in that core form, it is not superstition at all. It is wisdom. Sleep well. The mirror, for now, is whole, and the face it shows you, familiar, specific, yours, is looking back with all the significance the oldest traditions always said it carried. The mirror, bad luck belief's relationship to other 7-year beliefs in folk tradition, illuminates the broader cultural significance of the 7-year cycle. The 7-year itch, the folk belief that marriages face a particular challenge at the 7-year mark, later formalized in Marilyn Monroe's film, draws on the same underlying cultural framework as the mirror bad luck belief, the recognition that 7 years marks a significant threshold of change and renewal in human experience, that the person who exists at the 7-year mark is genuinely different from the person who began the 7-year period, and that this difference has practical and psychological consequences. The mirror bad luck belief and the 7-year itch are, in this reading, two expressions of a single underlying folk wisdom about the temporal structure of human life, that the self renews at 7-year intervals, and that the renewal brings both opportunity and risk. The final question that the mirror bad luck belief raises, the question that all the history and psychology and cultural analysis ultimately circle back to, is the question of what we mean when we say that something matters. The mirror matters, the tradition insisted. The reflection is not nothing. The broken image is not merely a practical problem, and the insistence on the mirror's mattering, maintained across 4,000 years of human history through every change of cultural framework, suggests that the insistence was right about something, that the mirror is indeed one of the objects through which the self most directly and most intimately encounters itself, and that this encounter is significant in ways that resist reduction to the merely optical. Sleep well. The mirror for now is whole, and the face it shows you, familiar, specific, yours, is looking back with all the significance the oldest traditions always said it carried.